By the end of the 80s, the wasteland had become the biggest building site in the world.
I remember first arriving here and seeing a forest of tower cranes and very little else. We recognized that at the beginning we would have to build a certain number of buildings to start with just to get people to move here and to realize that this wasn't just an office building in the middle of nowhere, but a place. And I think the risk was in creating that first group of buildings and expecting that companies would actually move here as a result.
Prospective companies were lured by huge government incentives, effectively giving the land to anyone who'd build on it, as well as paying for new transport links to bring city workers to their new offices. At first, all went swimmingly. Then the country was hit by recession, and suddenly no one would take the risk of relocation to a giant building site. The first Docklands developers went into receivership. When the economy did finally turn round, the developers had their master plan waiting. And the result was this, what's often been likened to a piece of Manhattan dropped from the sky.
People say when they're in Canary Wharf, this doesn't quite feel like London. And the reason why it doesn't feel like London is because it isn't like London. And the reason it's not like London is because it was master planned by American architects and planners, working really in a tradition of a grid, working right from the beginning with the idea that you should integrate transport and employment in one seamless way, which it does extremely successfully. In fact, the only problem it has is maybe it's a little bit too successful, but that's better than not being successful enough.
Where 100,000 men once handled cargo at the end of the war, just as many people now earn a living in financial services. By the turn of the century, this alien-looking invader had become a serious rival to London's old financial centre, the Square Mile. The old city was bound to respond to the challenge, and it has. This is the Square Mile today, in the midst of a colossal building boom. The most obvious feature of which is that its jumble of structures looks very different to the organised blocks of Canary Wharf. And that's because new buildings here don't stand on a regular grid. They stand on a street plan that hasn't changed radically in 1,000 years.
The streets of London, which is really the geography of London, especially the heart of London, is rooted in medieval history. They're narrow and basically they're for a horse and people who are walking. We've kept to that in most areas in the centre. This gives some pretty big constraints for 1,000 years later, should we say, where movement has completely changed. We don't have the sort of classical streets that you see in Paris or the grid forms you see in New York. We have grown very much ad hoc, piece by piece.
The name of the game here is to squeeze bigger and bigger offices into these irregular spaces. One of the best examples of how this can be done is the Gherkin, which cleverly creates more space in the air than it has on the ground with its bulging shape. Others are twisted into a variety of strange forms to maximize the limited space they have.
Architecture is basically developed out of constraints. The real art of architecture is getting a constraint when you can't avoid them, and then turning them upside down and seeing what sort of how they fit.
But there's more in the city than just a street plan to challenge an architect. There are dozens of ancient buildings, none greater than the looming presence of St. Paul's Cathedral. For 350 years, St. Paul's has been a jewel in the architectural crown of the city, and is now so venerated that even the views of it from miles across the city are protected by planning laws. Fortunately, there's a new visual tool to help architects avoid the problem. This picture, and thousands like it, form part of a giant 3D graphic model, showing the whole city with St. Paul's at its heart. These are the sight lines where the greatest restrictions on building are enforced. It was in one of these corridors that Richard Rogers was asked by developers British Land to create what would be the tallest office block in the City of London, a structure that would stand right behind the cathedral.
The only way to get out of the view is to slope backwards out of the views. So when you're looking specifically from the west side of London, you would block St. Paul's if the building was straight up. So we move it sideways, and you get, shall we say, a sort of A shape, or as it's been termed, a cheese grater.
This is it, the cheese grater at 122 Leadenhall, a 225-metre, 48-storey office block, London's newest skyscraper, as it will look very soon. What's made this possible is the creative power of 3D graphics. Rogers' design partners Cityscape built a virtual 3D model of the whole of the City of London and then plonked into it a millimetre-perfect vision of the Leadenhall building, proving before the first stone was ever laid that it would fit into the existing city. And the Leadenhall building won't be the last to make use of this new technology. Each one of these structures is set to grace the skyline in the next few years.
There must be change, always change, as one season or one generation follows another.
When Lord Abercrombie first proposed building a new city after the war, it was assumed it could only be done by tearing down and starting again with a great plan.
In the late 1940s, people believed in planning, and they believed that planning was going to create a better London, a better Britain, and a better world.
London did change, but not through grand designs or utopian ideals, but by commerce and opportunity and the creative energy of its people.
Today, London is the greatest capital in the world. The only competition is New York. So there's a big change, not only in economic, but in social as well, in the vitality of the city. So that's fantastic. And it comes out of that sort of marriage of 1,000 years between old and new, the more formal, like the churches, the town halls, city halls, and so on, and the wonderful medieval structures of the old buildings, and the modern buildings. So they all sit together.
Not everyone loves the way London is changing, but London is simply doing what London always has: making money, making compromises, evolving.